Good morning, everybody. It's time for Reading with Mr. Bob again today. And this is the second part of our new series in the book called The Hobbit, written by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, J.R.R. Tolkien was one of my favorite authors. He's written several books, and he wrote a book that's not as well known that perhaps you might want to read it some other time, called A Leaf by Niggle. Anyway, we are in the middle of chapter 1 called An Unexpected Party. And if you're reading along with me, it's on page 20 if you have the same book that I do. Anyway, if you remember, he had met Gandalf, and Gandalf had said that he wanted him to go on an adventure, but Bilbo did not want to go. And so the next morning, Bilbo hears a knock on the door, and we're going to start just about where we left off, maybe just a little bit before where we left off before. So, just before tea time, there came in a tremendous ring on the front door. And then he remembered. He rushed and put on the kettle and put on another cup and saucer and an extra cake or two and ran to the door. "I'm so sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say, when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside, just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg and said, "Dwalin, at your service." And he said this with a low bow. "Bilbo Baggins, at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added, "I am just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little stiff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation? They had not been at the table long. In fact, they had hardly reached the third cake, when there came another even louder ring at the bell. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and off he went to the door. "So you've got here at last," he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it was again not Gandalf at all. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was open, just as if he had been invited. "I see they had begun to arrive already," he said, when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it and said, "Balin, at your service." And he said this with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, as the host, he knew his duty and stuck to it however painful. He might have to go without. "Come along and have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better, if it's all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin with the light beard. "But I don't mind some cake, seed cake if you have any." Lots," Bilbo found himself answering, to his own surprise. And he found himself scuttling off, too, to the cellar to fill a pint of beer, and to the pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes, which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them, when loud came a ring at the bell again, and then another ring. Gandalf for certain this time, he thought, as he puffed along the passage. But it was not. It was 2 more dwarfs, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped as soon as the door began to open. Bilbo was hardly surprised at all at this time. "What can I do for you, my dwarves?" he said. "Kili, at your service," said one, and "Fili," said the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin are already here, I see," said Kili. "Let us join the throng." "Throng?" thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I must really sit down for a moment and collect my wits and have a drink." He had only had just a sip in the corner, while the 4 dwarves sat around the table and had talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and the depredations of dragons, and lots of other things which he did not understand, and did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous. When ding-dong-a-ling-a-ding, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some four, I should say, by the sound," said Feely. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head to his hands and wondered what had happened, and what was going to happen, and whether they would all stay to supper. Then the bell rang again louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not 4 after all. It was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall, and he had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dory, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were their names. And very soon 2 purple hoods, a gray hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs. And off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already had become almost a throng. Some called for ale, some for porter, one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, so the hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had been set in the hearth, the seed cakes were gone, and the dwarves were starting on a round of butter scones, when there came a loud knock, not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage very angry and altogether bewildered and beweathered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he had ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of the other. More dwarves! 4 more! And then there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had also made quite a dent in the beautiful door. He had, by the way, knocked out the secret mark they had put there the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat. And then open the door like a pop gun. Let me introduce Bifur, Bofer, Bombur, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Bifur and Bofer and Bombur, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods, a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf, in fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not pleased at all at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Bifur, Bofer, and Bombur on top of him. For one thing, Bombur was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin indeed was very haughty, and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Pray don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now we are all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there's something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? Oh, no, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for myself." "And for me," said Thorin. "And raspberry jam and apple tart," said Bifur. "And mince pies and cheese," said Bombur. "And pork pie and salad," said Bombur. "And more cakes and ale and coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarves to the door. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him, and the hobbit jumped off to the pantries. "Just bring out the cold chicken and pickles." "Seems to know as much about the inside of my larders as I do myself," said Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed, and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had gotten all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face and annoyed. "Confusticate and be bother, these dwarves," he said. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, Feely and Keely behind them, and before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlor, and set out everything afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarves all around. Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside, nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least an adventure. The dwarves ate and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. "I suppose you will all stay to supper," he said in his politest, unpressing tones. "Of course," said Thorin. "And after. We shan't get through this business till late, and we must have some music first. Now, to clear up." Thereupon the 12 doors, not Thorin, he was too important, and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped to their feet, and made tall piles of all things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on the top, one with one hand, while the Hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright. "Please be careful, and please don't trouble, I can manage." But the dwarves only started to sing. "Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks, that's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread on the fat, pour the milk on the pantry floor, leave the bones on the bedroom mat, splash the wine on every door. Dump the crocks in a boiling bowl, pound them up with a thumping pole, and when you're finished, if any are whole, send them down the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates, so carefully with the plates." And of course they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was clean and put away as safe and quick as lightning, while the Hobbit was turning around and round in the middle of the kitchen, trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin with his feet on the fender, smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and whenever he told one to go, it went up the chimney, or behind the clock on the mantel, or under the table, round and around the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He sent a smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe through each one of Thorin's. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head. He was a wizard after all. He had quite a cloud of them about him already, and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood and still and watched. He loved smoke rings, and then he blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday morning of the smoke rings he had sent up the wind over the hill. "Now for some music," said Thorin. "Bring out the instruments." Keely and Feely rushed for their bags and brought back the fiddles. Nori, and Ori brought out flutes from somewhere inside their coats. Bombur produced a drum from the hall. Bifur and Bofur went out too, and came back with clarinets that they had left among the walking sticks. Dwalin and Balin said, "Excuse me, I left mine in the porch." "Just bring mine in with you," said Thorin. They came back with vials as big as themselves, and with Thorin's harp wrapped in a green cloth. It was a beautiful golden harp, and when Thorin struck it, the music began all at once, so sudden and sweet that Bilbo forgot everything else, and was swept away into dark lands under strange moons, far over the water, and very far from his hobbit hole under the hill. The dark came into the room from the little window that opened on the side of the hill. The firelight flickered. It was April, and still they played on, while the shadow of Gandalf's beard wagged against the wall. The dark filled all the room, and the fire died down. The shadows were lost, and still they played on. Suddenly, first one and then another began to sing as they played, deep-throated singing of the dwarves in the deep places of their ancient homes. And this is like a fragment of their song, if it could be like their song without music. "Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to seek the pale enchanted gold. The dwarves of yore made mighty spells, while hammers fell like ringing bells, in places deep where dark things sleep, in hollow halls beneath the fells. For ancient king and elvish lord, their many a gleaming golden hoard, they shaped and wrought, and light they caught, to hide in gems on hilt of sword. On silver necklaces they strung, the flowering stars on crowns they hung. The dragon fire in twisted wire, they meshed the light of moon and sun. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to claim our long forgotten gold. Goblets they carved there for themselves, and harps of gold where no man dells, and there they lay long, and many a song was unheard by men or elves. The pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, it was flaming spread, the trees like torches blazed with light. The bells were ringing in the dale, and men looked up with faces pale. The dragon's ire, more fierce than fire, laid low their towers and houses frail. The mountain smoked beneath the moon. The dwarves, they heard the tramp of doom. They fled their hall to die and fall, beneath his feet, beneath the moon, far over the misty mountains grim, to dungeons deep and caverns dim. We must away ere break of day, to win our harps and gold from him. As they sang, the hobbit fell the love of beautiful things made by hands, and by cunning and magic moving through him, a fierce and jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. Then something tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains, and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls, and explore the caves, and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked out the window. The stars were out in a dark sky above the trees. He thought the jewels of the dwarves shining in dark caverns. Suddenly, in the wood beyond the water, a flame leapt up. Probably somebody lighting a wood fire. And he thought a plundering dragon settling on his quiet hill and kindling it all to flames. He shuddered, and very quickly he was playing Mr. Baggins of Bag End, Underhill, again. And we're going to stop there. We'll continue on next time. I hope you're enjoying the story. J.R.R. Tolkien was a professor at Oxford University, and he was also perhaps best friends with C.S. Lewis, the great writer who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, which you may be familiar with. Anyway, it's one of those interesting things. They both lived and worked at Oxford University in Oxford, England. And I've been there with my wife, Dorinda. It's a beautiful place. And maybe next time I will be able to show you some pictures on a PowerPoint if I can work it up. So anyway, until next time, have a good start to the week, and we will talk to you soon. This is Mr. Bob. Goodbye.